right, folks, welcome back in. We are back here once again talking about subtropical storm Nicole. This is the second video update this morning on Nicole. We had a quick update this morning, it's about 7-8 minutes long, just posted. That is the latest and greatest on Nicole in the broad brush sense. If you're looking for the quick impacts and quick overview, that is the video you want to go find. It'll either be on the feed or on YouTube if that's where you're watching. But we're back here just talking more of the weather side of Nicole and in general. I split these videos up when we have time because it's a lot to pack into a 13 plus minute video if we're talking about like the meteorological aspects and talking about impacts, especially with a big complicated storm like Nicole. There's a lot to get to, so I don't want to bore a lot of the listeners with a bunch of stuff they don't really care about. But if you want something to put on, let the dog think somebody's home or something, this is the video for you. So again, subtropical storm Nicole. A lot of people don't really know the difference in a subtropical and tropical storm. I don't even think a lot of meteorologists know the difference. The biggest thing we're looking at this morning is the structure of Nicole is very atypical of what you would see in a normal tropical storm. So I'll zoom in a little bit on the true color satellite imagery here, once again on tropical tidbits, kind of show you. So if you focus in the center of your screen, you'll actually see this vigorous low-level swirl here. This is actually the center of Nicole. And this is probably at least partially tropical. There's not much in the way of anchored thunderstorm activity. You can see the sides of the circulation are pretty open. There's a few thunderstorms on the northern side, but even then, those are very strong storms. They're not very high up extending. If you put on the IR, you would not see much in the way of convection. I mean, a little bit, but pretty anemic convection. This is because Nicole is not just feeding off the warm ocean water; she's feeding off of the upper level processes that help create the storm, because what basically happened is a finger of the jet stream dipped down and kind of made this storm, pulled all this moisture up and kind of kick-started this. But this upper level low or upper trough that's about to become an upper low is what's supporting the cold. And that's why it has this weird appearance, because this is actually the center of the storm, but you have kind of this line of clouds, and you have a lot of dry air on both sides of that line of clouds, and then you've got all this weather off to the north. Because this is definitely not a classic tropical storm, but there's a tropical core here, and this is what we'll watch over the next couple of days to start acquiring more thunderstorm activity. And what's going to happen in the coming days as this storm moves up and then back down towards Florida, it's going to cross some pretty warm water in the mid to upper 80s, and that will begin to feed off that ocean water, and you'll start to see more tropical thunderstorms originate near this core of wind, and that's what will likely become tropical storm Nicole in a day or two, and then eventually Hurricane Nicole before it makes landfall. Like I said, we already talked about a lot of the big forecast notes. This is the Hurricane Center's morning outlook. Interestingly enough, these come out at 4 and 10 a.m. now. I don't know if I've ever tracked a tropical storm this late in the season. I think I actually have. I think I remember saying this now last year during the storms that hit South America, or Central America rather, the Eta and Iota, or whatever the two were, the big ones that hit down there. But since the time change now, the Hurricane Center is going to do their updates at 4 and 10 a.m. Eastern time instead of 5 and 11 a.m. So that's a little nugget there. It says 11 a.m. on the map. That's AST, not Eastern time. So the hurricane watches are up for the Bahamas and also up for much of south central Florida. Lake Okeechobee is down to about Hollandale Beach and then back up to the Volusia-Brevard County line. Pretty common break points for them. The models have been remarkably consistent on this kind of West Palm, Lake Okeechobee sort of landfall location as far as the center of the storm. And again, I want to stress, like I did in the other video, how far north this storm is going to be weighted because of that combination with that nor'easter that we were talking about to the north. So there's a lot of impacts, and notice how much further north, like if you draw this as the center line for the storm, pretend the storm landfalls right where it's expected to, or I'll do this, I'll turn on the forecast track. So this is the center line of the forecast track. Look at how far south it extends versus how far north it extends. I mean, that's a huge difference because most of the storm's effects are going to be weighted to the north of the landfall point. So we talked a lot about the satellite presentation already. The water vapor shows this pretty well too. The water vapor is really curious because what you're seeing is the cutting off of the trough that is supporting Nicole right now. You kind of have this dip in the jet stream that goes down and back up. But what's happening is now at this point, this dip is almost completely cut off. And what's going to happen eventually is the jet stream is just going to go ahead and start cutting this off completely. And what you're going to have is an upper low that's completely detached from the jet stream or the jet finger that was supporting it, and then the upper level low is going to sit over the low level center of Nicole. You'll have this low level center of Nicole spinning in here, and you'll have this broader upper low over Nicole, and then eventually that upper level low will begin to decay, and that's when Nicole will likely lose her subtropical characteristics and become a more classic tropical storm when it stops being impacted by that upper low. And that process shows pretty well in the GFS. We talk about the potential for intensification. We're talking about it a little bit further down the road. We're talking about really Wednesday into early Thursday. This is the current situation. You have your low pressure center right here, but you can see this is definitely on the edge of this upper low, and it's wrapped up pretty well. But you can see for now on the GFS this morning, it still shows as a very sharp trough at 200 millibars. But notice how the winds have to curve really far down, all the way back up, and the physics just don't allow for this. So what eventually happens is this just cuts off. So we go another day or two, and the storm has been cut, the low has been cut off completely, and now you've kind of got this weird upper, kind of hybrid trough thing going on. But what happens is Nicole starts tucking up under an area of lighter wind shear. As I go back a little bit, the storm is still pretty much entangled in all this wind shear of the upper low. What happens in a couple days, we go into Tuesday and even into Wednesday, the wind shear pattern becomes more favorable. Now, normally this is a very hostile part of the Atlantic basin. That's why you get so few storms this time of year. As we talked about historically, this is very rare air. We had the Expedition Hurricane in 1861 hit North Carolina. On November 2nd. The Yankee hurricane hit in 1935 on November 4th in South Florida, and Hurricane Kate hit the panhandle of Florida in 1985. There's only been 3 hurricanes on record to impact the United States in the month of November, actually make landfall. So few do, because typically the wind shear pattern over the southeast U.S. is very chaotic by this point. The fall weather pattern has fully set in by November, and there's just typically way too much wind shear. But what's happening here is you have this little pocket of wind shear. You have this very strong upper ridge. The GFS shows this pretty well too, but 500 millibars. We'll go ahead and back this up a little bit. This is right where Nicole begins to intensify kind of the same time, late Tuesday. Look at this anomalous ridge. This is a huge ridge for this time of year. Moving in, very amplified pattern, long wave trough, long wave ridge, and the Nicole hiding up under that, but she's hiding on this very edge of the ridge where the wind shear is actually at its lowest, because the upper level wind flow kind of splits around Nicole to the north and the south, and there's this pocket of lighter wind shear. So we go back to the upper level winds, there's still some shear coming in to the south, but the storm is kind of hiding in this little pocket where the wind shear is fairly light, and it's going to have a nice little outflow channel. This jet streak to the north is going to probably pull some air away from Nicole and help that outflow pattern to the north. So that'll actually be helping the storm as well, ventilate it a little bit. Again, that air escapes from Nicole, then has this artificial exhaust outlet. It's kind of like blowing on a fire at just the right amount to give it more oxygen, but not so much that it suffocates it. It's kind of how this works to a degree. And most of that wind shear at this point goes south of Nicole. So on Wednesday, this is where we think the wind shear is the lightest, and the moisture, which is Nicole's other problem she has. That dry air this morning, definitely a problem. A lot of dry air here, definitely a lot of dry air here. Also shows up on water vapor, dry air, and then the strong finger of dry air feeding in. GFS shows us on the relative humidity chart pretty well. That line of clouds, where the moisture is currently located, but it's flanked by dry air on both sides. This is interrupting thunderstorm activity and all that stuff that lets these things develop. We go into another day and a half or so, we get this thing down by the Bahamas, and that dry air begins to mix out of the storm, and this is right where the wind shear relaxes, and this is why the Hurricane Center thinks that Nicole will become a hurricane. She loses her subtropical characteristics, which subtropical storms will overcome rough odds. Like if you see them out, and like typically what you'll see subtropical storms is like in the middle of the Atlantic, like in the North Atlantic, right? And they'll overcome marginal sea surface temperatures, they'll overcome wind shear, they'll overcome dry air, because they're being forced by the atmosphere to develop. Whereas a tropical storm develops naturally by the ocean heat processes and the tropical waves developing, all that fun stuff. But that's why they're more susceptible to dry air, lack of ocean temperatures. That's what they need. Whereas a subtropical storm is kind of being forced to develop. So when Nicole loses, so sorry, back up a little bit. So the subtropical storms, when they develop, though, the process also limits how strong they can be. because eventually they can only become so strong because of the marginal environment. So if you lose the subtropical processes, you lose that cap on your potential intensification, but you also then have to have the ingredients in place. And Nicole will have the ingredients in place later on this week with the warm water. She'll have the lighter wind shear, and then she'll have the moisture increasing. And that's why we think this is going to catch a window sometime Wednesday morning through the landfall Thursday morning of intensification, and why we think it's going to be a hurricane at landfall. It'll lose those subtropical characteristics, become tropical storm Nicole, and then probably eventually hurricane Nicole before the landfall. But the GFS shows this well, and the HWRF actually showing this pretty well too. We even go into Tuesday, what we're seeing is kind of a vertically misaligned system. This is another common problem with the subtropical storm. Is your low and mid levels don't always align very well. This is showing the wind barbs are at 700 millibars. The low level or the mid level center would be over here, and you can see the low level center stamped here. And you have this vertical misalignment of the cores. The storm is leaning to one side, which will disrupt the core processes that it needs to undergo to become a stronger storm. But you can see that dry air also definitely intruding on it. A lot of browns getting into the core. If you see browns right around that low pressure center, that's bad news for Nicole. And this happens into early Tuesday. But as we go later in Tuesday, notice how the pressure doesn't really fall much at 993, 995. It kind of holds steady through much of tomorrow or tonight and into tomorrow. We go into Wednesday or Tuesday night into Wednesday morning, you can see now we've stacked up. The low and mid-level centers are much closer to being aligned, and that pressure is beginning to fall down to the 980s, and your moisture is increased. You're having less browns, and they're further away from the core. The storm is mixing that dry air up and out of the storm, and then as it gets to the Bahamas, that's when the more intensification begins, and you have a hurricane on your hands as it crosses Great Abaco and Grand Bahama Islands and moves across into parts of Florida over the coming days. So that's kind of the meteorological why as to the intensification. The track is going to largely be dependent on the speed of this upper trough. Now, if we look at the ensemble models, a couple days ago, we had a lot of tracks that showed potential for the storm to recurve before Florida. Those tracks are almost completely off the table. Both the European and the GFS are driving this through the peninsula and then almost into the Gulf of Mexico before it makes that turn north. Why is that? Well, that's because the trough ejection time has slowed down. So what we're watching right now is this big trough moving into the West Coast. The West Coast is going to bring a ton of rain and snow, and it's basically going to end fire season on the West Coast and bring a lot of really beneficial rain, which is very good news for the region out there. But this trough is going to ride across the U.S. this week. So you got Nicole coming up under the ridge. You've got this big trough moving into the west. It's going to come across, and all this slides around. Nicole makes that bend because the high pressure begins to push her southward while it's still centered over the Appalachians. It forces her downward. But then later on in the week, we go into Wednesday and Thursday. Notice how that high begins to migrate. It breaks down, and it starts moving to the east. And Nicole is simply going to ride up under the high. Again, high pressure rotates clockwise. So it's rotating like this, and it's pushing Nicole along to the west. But here comes this big trough out to the west, out by Texas and the Four Corners, and this is what's going to eventually capture Nicole and move her off to the north. Now, the timing on this is slowed down, which means that the storm has more time to come further west. Say if the trough, if we back this up, say in a couple days this trough was right here instead of right here, Nicole would turn sooner in response to that and could go up into the Carolinas or up into New England or something. But because the trough is so far behind where Nicole is, it's going to be able to come a lot further west before it begins to feel the influence of that trough and move out to sea. So that's what we're timing right now. And there's still some timing to go with this one, but that's generally the idea. And now why the ensembles are all showing the potential wiggle room being, well, how far into the Gulf does it get? Not does it get into the Gulf at all? Or does it even go into Florida at all? It is going into Florida at this point. It's just how far does it get? Now, people who are probably still watching at this point are probably going, you're probably smart enough to go, well, it's getting into the Gulf. Are we going to see a potential re-intensification? That looks unlikely. The if I can get my thing to come up here. The first thing we're gonna see is that the wind shear will pick up pretty quick. So Nicole comes across. This is set for Thursday. You can see the trough beginning to influence it. Wind shear is already picking up out of the southwest. Nicole's in the Gulf of Mexico in the GFS on Thursday afternoon. But as it approaches, that wind shear is definitely going to be picking up on the storm, and it's just not likely going to be able to develop too. It's going to be that wind shear, and the water temperatures off the west coast of Florida aren't that high right now, so I don't think she'd find much in the way of warm water to kickstart a re-intensification. It's definitely not nearly as warm as the East Coast waters are and the Gulf Stream waters are. And it looks like, you'll also probably be dealing with some more dry air problems as she comes across. Well, on the GFS, not so much, but well, yeah. I mean, look at that. Look at the GFS as it comes in. See how fast that dry air begins to erode that west side of the storm. So you'll probably have a combination of factors that will lead to this not intensifying as it comes off the coast here. But something to watch at least. If it moves fast enough, it may not lose intensity as much. So that could be an issue for northern Florida, north central Florida, and south Georgia if she doesn't lose this much intensity. But a re-strengthening is not anticipated right now. So that kind of covers the latest, as far as the meteorological aspects of this. What are some potential outliers? What could change right now? Well, what we're going to have to watch is how fast that tropical transition begins. Because again, as a subtropical storm, she's going to have a broad wind field, and she's going to be, a decently strong storm. But it also is limited on the ceiling it can have as a subtropical storm. So we're going to have to see when that tropical transition begins. Right now, the thunderstorm activity is pretty anemic. There's a lot of dry air, and it's going to take some time to undergo the processes that begin to moisten up the atmosphere around this core and start letting it anchor some more substantial thunderstorm activity. But the timing of that process is going to be important, and we're going to have to see how fast it makes that dry air out, because the dry air is riddled in the storm right now. It is all over the storm, and that's going to take some time to get up out of there. A lot of arc clouds. You can see these arc clouds patterns moving through. It's definitely taking its time. It's going to have to take some time to get that process going. And then essentially when it all lines up, as it goes up and recurve down, how fast do those centers align, and what does that look like? And how much of a window does it essentially get between the Bahamas and Florida to actually pick up on enough intensity to make that landfall point? But as I said in the other video, this will be a lot of big impact. There's already that onshore flow starting for Florida. This is only going to increase in the coming days. This is going to be a big coastal flooding problem, as we talked about in the other video. Potential for 3 to 5 inches of rain, both on the WPC and GFS forecast models. The wind gust forecast, a lot of tropical storm force winds are coming from the Florida Peninsula, and the potential for hurricane force winds along a swath of the south central Florida Peninsula. And European not showing as high of wind gusts, but the European is lower on overall intensity. You can see though, the coastline is going to get pummeled for days to come, and the storm surge forecast from the National Hurricane Center, 3 to 5 feet of surge. This could be very similar to what Ian brought to a lot of the east coast of Florida. But you're not talking about as intense of an event, but you're talking about a much longer duration of an event. So a lot to talk about with that. So that's kind of the latest on the meteorological kind of walkthrough of this. We'll probably do another one or two of these. My day job's mostly involved being outside this week, so I don't think I'm going to have a whole lot of work on my hands. So I'll be here to put out more content. And we'll talk more about like Northeast Florida coming up. We'll probably do a video maybe tonight on the potential Northeast Florida impacts and stuff like that. So that's what I got for you guys on the other update video this morning and whatnot. And we'll have more for you. So as always, thanks for watching. Have a good one.